Could Mosasaurus survive modern oceans? The Cretaceous apex meets orcas. Mosasaurus ran the Cretaceous oceans. For roughly 16 million years, nothing challenged it. It patrolled the shallow, warm seas of the late Cretaceous with double-hinged jaws and a mouthful of recurved, blade-like teeth. And as far as the fossil record is concerned, it answered to absolutely nobody. But drop that same animal into a modern ocean, face to face with a creature that never has to fight fair, and the crown starts to look a lot less secure. Orcas are something else. They're not bigger, they're not longer. Pound for pound, tooth for tooth, a lone orca does not out-muscle a 15-meter marine reptile built to swallow prey whole. But this was never going to be a fight between two individuals. It's a fight between one apex predator that has always hunted alone and one that has never needed to. This is Survival Decoded, the series where I test fictional and prehistoric creatures against the harshest worlds in gaming and nature. Today we're doing something a little different. No game world, no simulated biome, just two real apex predators separated by 66 million years, forced into the same water. I'm going to break this matchup down across 4 categories: habitat adaptability, dietary compatibility, competition and predation, and reproductive success. Each one gets scored out of 10, and at the end we add it all up for a final verdict. And make sure you stick around until the end, because after that, we'll explore 3 ways Mosasaurus might evolve over time to close the gap it's about to reveal in Category 3. Here we go. Before we start scoring, let's be precise about what we actually know, because a lot of what people think they know about Mosasaurus comes from a movie appearance rather than the actual paleontology. Mosasaurus hoffmannii lived in the western interior seaway and other epicontinental seas roughly 82 to 66 million years ago, right up until the end. Cretaceous extinction event took it out along with the non-avian dinosaurs. Older estimates, some going back over a century, put its length as high as 17 or 18 meters, largely extrapolated from fragmentary skull material. More recent work, using more complete skeletal comparisons, has walked that back. Most current reconstructions land somewhere around 13 to 15 meters, which is still enormous, easily larger than any orca that has ever been measured, just not quite the sea monster of early popular imagination. That distinction matters, because every category we're about to run through depends on getting the numbers right, instead of reaching for the biggest one available. Overstating the animal doesn't make the analysis more exciting, it just makes it wrong, and it undermines the comparison before we've even started scoring anything. Mosasaurus evolved for shallow, warm, epicontinental seas. The western interior seaway averaged somewhere in the 20 to 25 degrees Celsius range, a long, wide, relatively uniform body of water cutting straight through what's now the middle of North America, from the Gulf of Mexico up toward the Arctic. Depth across most of that seaway rarely exceeded a few hundred meters, and large stretches of it were far shallower than that. Its whole body plan was shaped by that world. Soft tissue fossils discovered around 2013 revealed something researchers hadn't seen before. Mosasaurus had a shark-like bilobed tail fluke, built for sustained undulating propulsion through open, temperate water, rather than the eel-like tail shape earlier reconstructions assumed. That's a beautifully specialized tool for the environment it actually lived in, efficient long-distance cruising through a warm, shallow, current-driven sea. The modern ocean is not that environment, and the difference isn't subtle. It's colder at depth almost everywhere, more thermally layered, with a thermocline that in many regions drops water temperature by 10 or 15 degrees Celsius within 100 vertical meters. It includes polar water at both ends of the planet, something that simply didn't exist as a factor for a mid-latitude Cretaceous predator whose entire known range sat closer to the equator than to either pole. Orcas are the most widely distributed mammal on the planet after humans. They're recorded from the equator to the pack ice of Antarctica, hunting in tropical reef systems and under multi-meter thick sea ice with equal competence. That range isn't an accident. It's built on a thick blubber layer, sometimes 10 centimeters or more, and a counter-current heat exchange system in the flippers, flukes, and dorsal fin that lets them dump or retain heat depending on what the water around them is doing. An orca that swims from tropical water into the Southern Ocean doesn't need to adapt over generations. It's already equipped for both, physiologically, on a single migration. Here's where the size comparison actually helps Mosasaurus a little. At 13 to 15 meters against an orca's 6 to 8, it has a real thermal advantage in one specific way. Larger body volume relative to surface area retains heat more efficiently, a basic physics constraint that applies to any large marine animal, cold-blooded or not. And there's a second point in its favor: emerging isotope research from fossil mosasaur bone, including work by Bernard and colleagues in 2010 analyzing oxygen isotopes in mosasaur tooth enamel, has suggested some mosasaurs may have run a mesothermic metabolism. That means an internally elevated body temperature, sitting somewhere between a cold-blooded reptile fully dependent on ambient water temperature and a fully warm-blooded mammal generating its own heat regardless of surroundings. That's not nothing. It suggests Mosasaurus wasn't purely at the mercy of ambient water temperature, the way, say, a modern crocodile is, and it may have been able to maintain a body temperature several degrees above the surrounding seawater. But mesothermic isn't the same as what orcas run. In orcas, thermoregulation is total. Full endothermy, full insulation, engineered across every ocean on Earth, letting it maintain a stable internal temperature regardless of whether the water outside is 4 degrees or 28. Mosasaurus, for all its scale advantages, has never once encountered polar ice, a thermocline that drops 15 degrees in under 100 meters, or the kind of open, unbounded deep water that makes up most of the modern ocean's volume. Roughly 90% of the ocean by volume sits below 200 meters, in permanently cold, dark water that no epicontinental sea like the Western Interior Seaway ever had to offer as an analog. Its whole sensory and physiological toolkit was built for a shallow inland sea, and shallow inland seas like the Western Interior Seaway simply don't exist anymore. That seaway closed as the continent rose and the Cretaceous ended. Nothing has replaced it since. So where does that leave the scoring? Mosasaurus gets partial credit for raw thermal mass and a plausible mesothermic edge, but it's working from an epicontinental seaway playbook that maps poorly onto the open, cold, vertically stratified modern ocean. Orcas are quite literally built for every version of that ocean at once, from tropical shallows to Antarctic pack ice, without needing so much as a behavioral adjustment. I'm scoring this one a habitat adaptability rating of 4 out of 10 for Mosasaurus. Mosasaurus looks flexible on paper. The fossil record shows it eating ammonites, fish, sea turtles, and, this part tends to surprise people, other mosasaurs. There's a well-documented specimen bearing bite marks matching a Tylosaurus, evidence of either predation or scavenging on a fellow mosasaur, and it's far from the only such case among the broader mosasaur family. That's a generalist ambush predator with a jaw built to back it up, an intramandibular joint, a hinge partway along the lower jaw that let Mosasaurus flex its mouth outward and swallow prey far larger than what a rigid jaw could manage. This is similar in principle to how a modern snake's jaw works, just on a scale suited to a 15-meter marine reptile. Combine that with rows of conical, recurved teeth angled backward for gripping rather than slicing, plus a second set of teeth on the roof of the mouth called pterygoid teeth, and you get an animal engineered to grab something big, hold on against any struggle, and force it down whole. Here's the problem, and it's a big one: ammonites are gone. They vanished in the same extinction event that took the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago, and they never came back. No lineage of coiled, shelled cephalopods has reoccupied that ecological role since. For an animal whose fossilized stomach contents and associated coprolites suggest ammonites made up a real chunk of its diet, that's not a minor menu adjustment. That's losing an entire food category permanently. The marine equivalent of a specialist predator finding out its primary prey species has been extinct for tens of millions of years. A modern Mosasaurus would have to pivot hard toward large fish, modern cephalopods like squid, and marine mammals just to replace those lost calories, using a jaw and tooth architecture that, while powerful, was optimized against a very different Cretaceous prey base with different shell structures and different escape behaviors. Orcas, by contrast, didn't just adapt to modern prey. They diversified into specialized ecotypes built around it, and this diversification is one of the best documented examples of ecological specialization in any living marine predator. Resident orcapods off the Pacific Northwest focus almost entirely on salmon, tracking specific runs with a precision that looks less like instinct and more like institutional memory passed between generations of the same matriline. Transient, or bigs, orcas hunt seals, sea lions, and even calves of other whale species, using stealth tactics closer to a wolf pack than a typical marine hunt. Offshore ecotypes target sharks in open water far from shore, and there's now solid photographic and observational documentation of orcas selectively predating great white sharks off the coast of South Africa and extracting the liver, a massive, energy-dense organ that can make up a large fraction of a shark's body mass, while leaving the rest of the carcass largely untouched on the seafloor. That's not blind aggression. That's a learned, transmitted hunting technique, passed down within a pod across generations, refined rather than reinvented each time. That word, transmitted, is the real dividing line here. Mosasaurus, however capable its jaw was, hunted using inherited instinct and raw mechanical advantage. It didn't have culture in the behavioral sense researchers use for orcas. It didn't pass down a liver extraction technique to its offspring the way an orca matriline does, refining the method generation after generation. Every individual mosasaur solved the problem of how do I eat today, more or less from scratch, using the same fixed toolkit its whole species carried since birth. Orcas solve that problem collectively, teach it, and get measurably better at it over time as techniques spread through a pod and then between pods. So Mosasaurus had raw dietary flexibility, backed by a genuinely formidable jaw. In practice, half its historical menu is extinct. Its remaining prey categories now include animals specifically evolved to survive coordinated predation from orcas, and it has no cultural mechanism to catch up to a predator that improves its technique across generations. I'm scoring dietary compatibility a 5 out of 10. One more wrinkle: prey armor. Ammonites carried coiled, calcified shells that Mosasaurus's jaw and teeth were specifically shaped to crush and puncture. A very different mechanical problem than dealing with the tough, muscular flesh of a modern squid or the fast, evasive swimming of a tuna. Losing ammonites didn't just remove calories, it removed the specific mechanical challenge those teeth were shaped to solve, leaving Mosasaurus with a toolset partially mismatched to what's actually swimming around it today. This is the category that actually decides the matchup, so let's slow down here. Despite their fearsome individual appearance, orcas rarely rely on individual strength to win a fight. They rely on coordination. There are documented cases of orcapods wave-washing, deliberately generating a synchronized swell by swimming in unison toward an ice flow to knock a seal off the ice and into open water, a technique that requires multiple animals timing their movement together to the second, not just brute force applied by one individual. There's footage and photographic evidence of orcapods taking down great white sharks, a species with essentially no natural predator of its own and a body plan optimized over millions of years to avoid exactly this kind of threat, by working in tandem to flip the shark into a state of tonic immobility before making the kill. None of that requires size superiority over the target. It requires communication, division of labor, and echolocation guided coordination across the whole hunting group, often executed in open water with no landmarks and no visual cues beyond what the pod generates itself. Mosasaurus has none of that toolkit because it never needed it. Every line of evidence, its jaw mechanics, its likely sensory adaptations built around ambush rather than pursuit, its position at the very top of its Cretaceous food web with no real competitor challenging that position points to a solitary ambush predator. It waited, it struck fast using surprise as its primary weapon, it delivered one overwhelming bite designed to end the encounter immediately, and it won over and over for millions of years. That's an extremely effective strategy against a single target, whether that target is a sea turtle, a fish, or a rival mosasaur. It has absolutely no answer for 8 or 10 coordinated animals converging on it from multiple directions at once, using sound to track its position even when visibility is poor or the water is murky. Here's the part worth being blunt about, and this channel does honesty over hype. If you actually put a solitary adult Mosasaurus in open water against a full orcapod, the encounter isn't close. This isn't a size mismatch. Mosasaurus wins the size comparison outright, and probably wins any encounter limited to a single orca. It's a structural mismatch. A body plan optimized across 16 million years for one-on-one ambush predation was never under selection pressure to develop a defense against synchronized multi-directional attack, because in its own time, in its own sea, that threat simply didn't exist. Selection can't prepare an organism for a predator it never once encountered across its entire evolutionary history. Let's look at the numbers plainly, because numbers make this concrete rather than abstract. A typical resident or transient pod runs anywhere from 2 to 50 animals, with cooperative hunting groups actively pursuing large prey often numbering somewhere in the 5 to 15 range. Even conservatively, that means a Mosasaurus engaging a full pod is outnumbered 5, 8, sometimes 10 to 1 against opponents actively coordinating attack angles from above, below, and both flanks simultaneously. Raw bite force and jaw mechanics matter enormously in a duel. They matter far less when the fight was never structured as a duel to begin with, and Mosasaurus's entire predatory strategy assumes exactly that kind of duel. This is where the Orca pack tactics versus Mosasaurus solo predation framing really lands, and it's the single most important idea in this whole video. It's not that orcas are individually the tougher animal. A Mosasaurus almost certainly wins any strict one-on-one encounter, and I want to be clear that this isn't a knock on Mosasaurus as a predator in isolation. It's that the modern ocean simply doesn't operate on one-on-one terms anymore, at least not among apex predators actively competing for the same resources in the same water column, and Mosasaurus has no evolutionary answer to that reality because that reality never existed during its 16 million years at the top. I'm scoring competition and predation a 2 out of 10, the lowest of the 4 categories, and frankly the one that decides this whole matchup more than the other 3 combined. Now for the category where Mosasaurus actually pulls ahead. Full credit here, not just racing to the next weakness, because a fair analysis has to acknowledge real strengths alongside real weaknesses. Mosasaurus was viviparous. It gave live birth directly in open water, with no return to any shore required at any point in its reproductive cycle. Fossil evidence from closely related mosasaurs, including Carsosaurus and Plotosaurus, shows neonate specimens preserved in context consistent with birth occurring far from shore in open marine settings. This means Mosasaurus never needed a nesting beach, never needed to haul out onto land or shallows to lay eggs, and never exposed a vulnerable egg-laying stage to predators the way, say, a modern sea turtle does every single nesting season. It could reproduce anywhere in its range, at any point along its migration, without ever being tied to a fixed, predictable location that predators or environmental disruption could target. That's a genuinely strong reproductive strategy, and it holds up even against a modern comparison to one of the most successful marine mammals alive today. Orcas reproduce more slowly than almost any other marine predator on the planet. Gestation runs 15 to 18 months, among the longest of any cetacean. Calving intervals stretch anywhere from 3 to 10 years between births, meaning a single female orca might only produce a handful of offspring across her entire reproductive lifespan. And the investment doesn't stop at birth. Orca calves stay dependent on their mothers for years, sometimes for the rest of the mother's life in the case of male offspring in resident pods, in a strategy biologists call K-selected, fewer offspring, enormously high investment per offspring, slow population growth in exchange for high survival odds per individual calf. That strategy pays off long term. It's a huge part of why orcapods sustain complex, multi-generational culture and refined hunting techniques passed across decades, but it comes with a real vulnerability baked into the math. A K-selected species recovers from population loss agonizingly slowly because you cannot simply produce more offspring faster when conditions call for it. When human activity, pollution, prey collapse, or any other pressure hits an orca population hard, it can take decades for that population to recover numerically, if it recovers at all. Mosasaurus, giving birth live and comparatively often, without a fixed reproductive site to defend or lose, without a multi-year gestation bottleneck of the same magnitude, was structurally built to bounce back faster from population shocks. That's not a small evolutionary advantage, and full credit belongs here rather than treating it as an afterthought. So while orcas dominate the intelligence and coordination side of this matchup decisively, Mosasaurus quietly wins reproduction on strategy alone, and it's a category worth taking seriously rather than dismissing because the rest of the matchup leans the other way. I'm scoring reproductive success, a solid 8 out of 10 for Mosasaurus. There's a subtler point buried in this comparison. Reproductive strategy isn't just about which animal produces more offspring, it's about which strategy survives sudden environmental shocks better. A mass die-off event, a toxin spike, a sudden prey collapse. Any of these hit a slow-reproducing, socially dependent species like the orca far harder over a short timescale than a fast-reproducing, independent species like Mosasaurus, precisely because the orca's recovery mechanism depends on time the population may not have. That's a genuine structural advantage, not just a technicality in the scoring. Why does reproductive strategy diverge this sharply between the two animals? It isn't arbitrary. It's a direct consequence of everything covered in the earlier categories. Orcas can afford a slow, high-investment reproductive strategy precisely because their social structure and coordinated hunting make individual survival odds unusually high once a calf reaches a certain age. A pod actively protects its young, teaches them, and shares food with them well past infancy, which is exactly the kind of behavior that makes a slow but safe reproductive strategy viable rather than a liability. Mosasaurus, without that social safety net, couldn't have afforded to wait 15 months per pregnancy and then guard a single dependent offspring for years afterward. Its fast, live-bearing, high-turnover strategy was the correct answer to being a solitary animal in a world without a pod to lean on. In other words, the very isolation that hurt Mosasaurus in the competition and predation category is part of what makes its reproductive strategy make evolutionary sense. The two categories aren't unrelated. They're two sides of the same solitary versus social divide that runs through this entire matchup. Let's add it up. Habitat adaptability, a 4 out of 10. Dietary compatibility, a 5 out of 10. Competition and predation, a 2 out of 10. Reproductive success, an 8 out of 10. That's 19 out of a possible 40. Here's the honest verdict. In a straight one-on-one encounter, Mosasaurus wins comfortably. Bigger, stronger jaw, more raw predatory power than any single orca could bring to bear in isolation. But the modern ocean was never going to test this animal one-on-one. It tests coordination, thermal range across the entire planet, and dietary flexibility against prey that has spent tens of millions of years learning to survive coordinated predators, including apex predators far larger than itself. Mosasaurus loses not because it's weaker in any individual sense. It loses because the rules of the game changed underneath it after it went extinct, and nothing in its evolutionary history ever asked it to adapt to that change because that change simply hadn't happened yet. And like I promised earlier, here's where it gets interesting. Let's run 3 speculative evolution scenarios and see whether extra time and extra pressure from orcas could actually close this gap, at least partially. In the first branch, imagine sustained predation pressure from orca packs pushing certain Mosasaurus populations toward loose aggregation behavior. Not full pod-based cooperation like an orca, with shared hunting and long-term social bonds, but a simpler, looser tolerance of nearby conspecifics during vulnerable feeding periods. Selection would favor individuals willing to feed and rest near others of their own kind, purely because more eyes and more bodies in the water make a coordinated ambush from orcas measurably harder to pull off cleanly against any single target. It wouldn't turn Mosasaurus into a pack hunter with shared strategy. It would just make it a slightly harder solo target, buying survival time through numbers rather than through any new offensive capability. In the second branch, picture a lineage that specializes toward deep diving instead of surface and midwater hunting. The same logic modern sperm whales use to chase giant squid at depths most surface predators can't reach efficiently or safely. Most orca hunting activity concentrates in surface and midwater zones, generally within the top few hundred meters where light and prey density are highest. A Mosasaurus lineage evolving toward regularly diving several hundred meters down, developing better pressure tolerance and low-light sensory adaptations along the way, would be stepping mostly outside the depth band where orca packs operate at full coordinated efficiency, trading some hunting opportunity and metabolic cost for a meaningful reduction in predation risk. And in the third branch, the opposite direction, selection favoring even greater body size and bite force over generations, aimed at making a lone Mosasaurus capable of seriously threatening or killing a single orca that strays from its pod, whether through injury, illness, or simple separation during a hunt. Honesty over hype again though. This branch doesn't actually solve the core problem we spent this whole video establishing. A bigger, stronger solo predator is still fundamentally a solo predator. It might win more one-on-one encounters with a stray orca, and it might even deter smaller pods from engaging at all. But it still has no answer for coordinated pod hunting as a single, communicating unit, which was always the real threat in the first place, and no amount of individual scaling changes that underlying structural weakness. If anything, a size increase without a matching increase in group awareness just produces a bigger, slower target for the same coordinated tactics that already beat the smaller version. Of the 3 branches, the cooperative aggregation scenario is probably the most biologically plausible over a long enough timescale, because loose social tolerance is a much smaller evolutionary step than either specialized deep diving or continued size escalation, both of which come with their own metabolic costs and trade-offs. But even that most plausible branch only reduces risk. None of the 3 scenarios fully closes the gap revealed in the competition and predation category, and that's an honest note to end the speculative section on, rather than pretending a clean fix exists. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss any future content. And if you want to support the channel, consider becoming a YouTube member today. You'll get sneak peeks of upcoming videos, early access to new releases, and custom emojis of your favorite creatures from the channel. Let me know down below which creature matchup you'd like to see tested next in a future episode. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks so much for watching all the way through.